today is Kelly Hayes Raitt. For nearly 3 decades, Kelly earned a reputation as a fearless advocate while working on dozens of California campaigns to protect the environment, secure consumers' legal rights, promote educational opportunities, protect workers, and fight for affordable and accessible health care. As a passionate and effective advocate, she's appeared on more than 500 radio and television public affairs shows, including PBS NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, CBS This Morning, CNN Financial News, and CNN Moneyline. Appointed to the Santa Monica Commission on the Status of Women, Kelly joined a women's delegation to Iraq just 5 weeks before the US-led invasion. The Iraqis touched her so deeply that she returned a few months later and provided on-air commentaries from Baghdad, Basra, and Fallujah to various radio stations, including National Public Radio. Kelly returned to the Mideast in 2008 to assist Iraq refugees in Damascus, Syria, and found some of the people she had met in pre-war Baghdad. To honor her humanitarian leadership, the Los Angeles County Commission on the Status of Women named Kelly Woman of the Year. An award-winning writer, Kelly is house-sitting in Ajijic this summer while completing a book about her experiences living large in limbo, How I Found Myself Among the World's Forgotten, which was recently excerpted in a Random House anthology. Several chapters have won writing awards, and she's been awarded 5 residential fellowships at writers' colonies, most recently in Białystok, Poland. In 2006, Kelly ran for state assembly in a hotly contested race. She lost, but we win, as she uses her sabbatical from state politics to bring us a global view of the individual people whose daily lives hinge on Americans' oil consumption and foreign meddling. Kelly Hayes Raitt. You all hear me? Is mic working okay? So a nigger and a kite walk into a bar. You all know this one? I can't believe that's even getting laughs. I was so intrigued when Margaret asked me about telling that joke today about the woman being 10 steps in front of her husband as a landmine sweep. And I was sort of initially horrified to think that that would be a joke that we would even say in polite society. But then I realized that the first time I heard that joke years ago, I laughed. And it got me thinking about the way we use humor to deal with issues that are so difficult for us. And I wanted to sort of be a little challenging in this opening today around that joke and around humor, because I was hoping that during the Q&A section that we could talk a little bit about your reactions to that joke and to the horrible incendiary opening I just gave. But I've been thinking the last couple of days about why I thought that joke was funny when I first heard it. And I've got sort of 2 theories around it. One is that I'm always struck by irony, and the idea that the United States and the US-led coalition could spend that much military effort in Afghanistan and Iraq, and not only are women not doing better, but they're doing worse, is something that just, it's so mind-boggling that it's almost funny when you think about it, right? But I think there's something deeper there. I think that we use humor, or at least I use humor, as a way of separating myself from feelings that I find difficult. So if I can create an other out there and project my fears on it, or my uncertainty on it, then that's a way of separating it. And it really wasn't that long ago in our society where polite people started jokes with a nigger and a kike and a wop and a wetback or a fag walked into a bar as a way of creating that other. This is not the way I usually start my talk. I usually start my talk with something that makes you feel, it endears you to me, right? I usually don't start a talk that way. But I wanted to do this because I was so struck with my reaction to what Margaret wanted to do. And we talked about this, so she knew what she was doing here. And I think this might become part of my book. So I really am very interested in your reactions on why you thought that joke was funny or not funny. And we can either talk about it afterwards. If you want to email me, that would be great. But I'd really like to have your reactions. Here's the way I usually start my talk. I'm Kelly Hayes Raitt. Thank you very much for having me here. It's really a pleasure and a joy to be here. I've heard so much about Open Circle, and it just is quite a treat to be here. As Margaret mentioned, I am writing a book about my experiences in Iraq, and the book is tentatively titled Living Large in Limbo, How I Found Myself Among the World's Forgotten. And I wanted to just open today by reading the opening chapter of it, and then telling you a little bit about my experiences in pre-war and post-invasion Iraq. This first chapter is titled Tongue-Tied. The one I want to wrap in my arms and bring home is Nabraz. I didn't even know her name when I went back to Iraq, shortly after the assault on Baghdad. I am armed only with a photo of a beggar touching her nose with her tongue. I had met her a few months before when I traveled to Iraq with a women's delegation, just 5 weeks before the U.S. bombings and invasion. Unfazed by impending disaster, the little girl, old enough to be in primary school, had begged for handouts in a popular market. I had taught her to touch her nose with her tongue. We teased. Clearly she wasn't used to an adult making faces at her and delighting in her company. She followed me around the soup, nearly swallowing her tongue in laughter as she imitated my nose-touching stunt. She was cold. The dirty scarf wrapped loosely around her neck neither protected her from the chill, nor hid her calculating ability to work the shoppers. Without a translator, the most I gathered was a photo of a gleeful girl with laughing eyes and an incredibly acrobatic tongue. When I returned to Iraq 5 months later to find how war had touched the people who had touched me so deeply, translators are reluctant to take me to the souk. The mood in Baghdad has shifted. Gunfire is heard nightly, and no one wants to be responsible for my harm. Finally, the day before I am to leave, I convinced one translator to take me shopping. We canvassed the cluttered shops for hours, flashing the little girl's photo. Yes, that's Nabraz! Finally, a shopkeeper gives a name to the girl whose deep brown eyes had humanized the smoldering CNN newscasts that absorbed my life back home. But I haven't seen her in a while. Not since before the war. I catch my breath. I had just learned Nabraz's name. She can't be one of the thousands of nameless Iraqis we dismissively call collateral damage. I step out into the bright sunlight, and my translator catches my arm. We need to leave, he insists. The equally insistent gunfire across the river rattles my nerve. I feel conspicuous in the souk's crowded, narrow alleys. People dart, avoiding eye contact. Shops close prematurely. Barricaded soldiers seem hyper-alert in the edgy heat. As we worm our way back to our car, I stifle my creeping panic. Behind me, a commotion erupts, and I turn around to see a crowd of men shoving toward me. I freeze. The shopkeepers part, revealing the terrified eyes of a familiar elfish girl they drag toward me by the scruff of her t-shirt. Nabraz doesn't recognize me at first. Not until I show her photos of herself does she smile. Backed against a shop, facing a tight crowd of curious men, Nabraz retreats shyly, studying her photo intently. I shoo the men back who had treated this beggar only as a nuisance, and kneeling before her, I asked the interpreter to tell her I'd come from America to see her. Without warning, the overwhelmed girl lunges forward and kisses me on the lips. We buy her an ice cream from a passing vendor. She unwraps it and holds it out to me. My defenses melt. After 2 weeks of rigorous attention to all food and water that passed my lips, I licked the sweet street fare, sacrificing my intestines to this little girl's pleasure of hosting a visitor with all she could offer. She's an only child who doesn't know her age. It was particularly ironic that we met outside the Al-Mustansiriya University, the world's oldest science college built in 1233. This schoolless girl's only education is learned navigating the streets outside the university's ancient walls. I empty my purse of dinars, stuffing the oily bills into her plastic purse. She gleefully buys another ice cream for us to share. Military helicopters zigzag overhead. Rumors that the American troops had closed bridges and jammed traffic made us jittery. Nebraska escorts me out of the dicey suit, grabbing my hand and expertly keeping my skirt from being snagged by the ubiquitous wartime razor wire. As we pass a store being repainted, she mentions it had been hit during the war's initial attacks. She had spent the long nights of the early bombings in a nearby mosque. I hug harder than I intended. I feel her wiry hair against my cheek, her grungy t-shirt against my shoulder, her warm, open heart so willing to accept mine. And then I'm gone. Thank you. I'm going to pass around a couple of things today. The first is that I'm building a mailing list, an email list of people who are interested in finding out when my book is coming out and who would like to stay in touch with me as I'm going through the writing process. So I have a couple of notebooks here for sign-in. So I'll start this over here. And if you'd like to sign up, it's free. And but just please print clearly, because I have a tough time. And let's see, let me start this sort of halfway back here. Here you go. Thank you. The title of my talk is Face to Face with the Women of Iraq, and I wanted to give you a chance to come face to face. So I have two photo albums. They're both the same. I'm going to pass around right now that you can look at during my talk. And there are photos of Nebraska in here as well. You'll recognize her. Here you go. You can just pass that way. Thank you, sure. So as Margaret mentioned, I went to Iraq in February 2003 with a women's delegation. And it was a rather unique experience for me because I hadn't intended to go to the Middle East. I never thought about going to the Middle East before. And I got an email from a passing acquaintance who told me she was going to Iraq to protest the war. And I just knew I was going. You know how sometimes something happens and you just know it? So I called up the tour organization that was putting the group together, told them who I was. They said, "We love you, but we're all filled up." I said, "Keep my application anyway," because I knew I was going. The following Monday morning, I got a call saying that I was part of the trip, and 78 hours later, I was in a cab on my way to LAX. It happened that quickly. I didn't know very much about the Middle East. I'd really never been to that part of the world at all, or really even knew anybody who'd been to that part of the world. So it was an entirely new experience for me. And one of the things that struck me was how warmly I was welcomed by people who were being so threatened with this oncoming war. To give you an example, the first day, several of us were walking down an alley, and some of us were wearing peace buttons. And I heard this voice from above. "Hello, peace! Hello down there, peace, peace!" I thought it was Allah. But it was this woman, right here in green. She worked at a sewing factory, and she knew English, so she was looking out her window and saw us with these peace buttons. And she invited us to come up and meet her and her coworkers at their sewing factory. And these women were so thrilled that a group of women had come all the way from America to bring them a message of peace. This is the message of peace they wanted me to bring back to you. I went back to the sewing factory when I returned to Iraq in June of 2003, after the war had started. There was nothing left. The floorboards had been pulled up. The electrical wiring had been pulled out. The toilets had been pulled out. It was a shell of a building that was now housing people who had been made homeless by the war. And you'll see those pictures in the albums going around. And that was what was happening so much with Iraq when I went back, was that the country had been so devastated by 2 other wars and 12 years of sanctions that there was nothing left for anybody to use. So I'm going to back up just a second and give just a little bit of historical context on where people were at when the war started. In 1979, Saddam Hussein took over Iraq in a bloody coup. That was the same year that the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran was put in power. Right? Shah was deposed and Ayatollah Khomeini took over. That was very destabilizing for the United States because Iran, of course, had been our ally. So in the 1980s, the United States made overtures to Saddam Hussein, and he was actually the U.S. ally in the Middle East. One of the first things that Saddam did was he attacked Iran. Over 1 million people died in the Iran-Iraqi war during the 1980s, during that decade. Then Saddam attacked Kuwait in 1991. The United States retaliated by dropping 90,000 tons of explosives over the entire country of Iraq in a 42-day period. 90,000 tons of explosives. We hit bombs, we hit bridges, we hit hospitals, schools, homes. And Iraq was unable to rebuild any of its infrastructure because then the UN imposed sanctions. So they couldn't rebuild their infrastructure. To give you an example, one of the things on the do not import list as part of the sanctions is chlorine. The US bombed Iraqi sewage treatment plants and water treatment plants during that first Gulf War. So as a result of the bombing and the sanctions and the fact that chlorine could not be imported because it might be used to build chemical weapons, Iraqis couldn't rebuild their sewage treatment plants. So during the 1990s, over 500,000 tons of metric sewage, raw sewage, was dumped into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers every day. And these were drinking water sources. So cases of typhoid, for example, skyrocketed from the average of 2,000 cases a year in the 1980s to 27,000 cases a year in the 1990s. Public health dropped so much that literally every other family in Iraq lost a child under the age of 5 during the 1990s before this last war. Drinking water was at such a low quality that the average Iraqi child had diarrhea 14 days a month. Now, this is really significant because at the time of the US-led bombing in March of 2003, there were 26 million Iraqis. Half of them were children under the age of 15. We were bombing kids. We were bombing sick kids. And that's how weakened the country was at that time. And yet, when I was there, everywhere I went, people were welcoming me. They were very excited to meet an American there. They were very hospitable. And I kind of figured that the reason for that is that they didn't want to be judged by their government leaders, and they weren't judging me by mine. So it was really quite an extraordinary experience. I mentioned that we dropped 90,000 tons of explosives over the entire country during the first Gulf War. In the first day of bombing just Baghdad in March of 2003, we dropped 10 times that amount. I'm going to say that again. One day of bombing just Baghdad, the United States and its coalition dropped 10 times the amount of firepower that we dropped over the entire country in a month and a half during the first Gulf War. One difference, our bombs were smarter this time. We hit every ministry building, every government ministry building, except for the Ministry of Oil. The Ministry of Health wasn't touched. The Ministry of Education, fine. But the Ministry of But the Ministry of Oil wasn't bombed, it wasn't looted, and it wasn't burned. And that fact wasn't lost on Iraqis. So when I went back, there was a lot of suspicion about why the Americans were there. I heard, a common refrain I heard was, "Thank you, Saddam is gone, now you need to leave too." I also had some skepticism among our US soldiers. This is one soldier I met, this was in July of 2003, outside of Saddam Hussein's main palace, which is now the Green Zone. And this soldier said, "You're a reporter? I want to talk to you." He pulled me aside and he said, "We haven't helped one damn person. We're here to drain their effing oil," although he didn't say effing. It saddened me to think that many of our troops there had some questions about what the United States' real, true reason for being in Iraq was. During the first Gulf War, the U.S. used depleted uranium in our munitions. Depleted uranium is a nuclear waste, and it's used in the munitions in order to penetrate metal better. But it's a nuclear waste, right? So it got embedded in the soil, into the food chain, into the water. And the pediatricians throughout Iraq have been able to sort of pinpoint the places where depleted uranium was used the most, because they saw pockets of increased birth defects, increased spontaneous abortions, miscarriages. There's a hospital, before the war, there's a hospital in Baghdad that treats these kids with, who are dying of leukemia. They can't get the chemotherapy. There's nothing anybody could do. But the moms bring their kids from the countryside to this hospital in Baghdad. And on that first trip, you can imagine, here we were, this group of women, and we're going kind of from room to room. Each room had 4 beds for the kids, with the IVs tethered, and then a small cot for the moms, and a closet, like a cupboard, where the moms would keep, their belongings. And what it is, the mothers would leave their families for weeks and bring their children to this hospital hoping for some sort of respite, some sort of miracle for their babies. So here we were going from room to room, bed to bed, passing out balloons and taking pictures and just trying to bring a moment into these kids' day. And as I was leaving one room, this one woman grabbed my hand and she started talking to me really fervently. But it was in Arabic, I couldn't understand her, so I called the doctor over and I said, this woman needs something. She needs something for her dying son. And the doctor listened to her and he said, no, that's not what she's saying. What she says is, we have everything we need. We just need peace. And then she asked me for my peace button, and I gave it to her. She pinned it on her abaya. We have everything we need. We just need peace. I want to introduce you to Surah. I met Surah during the first Gulf War. During the first, my first trip, right before this war. I met her at the Amaraya bomb shelter, which was a shelter where during the first Gulf War, 400 families in Baghdad had gone to escape a particularly bad night of bombing. And U.S. intelligence had indicated that Saddam Hussein was in this bomb shelter. So the U.S. did a direct hit on this bomb shelter, this civilian bomb shelter in the middle of the city, not once, but twice, and incinerated nearly everybody inside. Today, the bomb shelter is used as kind of a monument to the horrors of war. On that first trip, I walked through, and you could see the shadows on the walls, bloodstains on the floor. There was an engineer there who, on that first trip, who was sort of fixing it up to be more of a place where the public could come into, and he took me down to the basement. The bomb shelter had heated up so fast that all the pipes burst, and so water was rising. And dead bodies were floating. And the heat was so intense that it burned the skin off the bodies. And as the water receded, it left a scum of skin down in the basement. And it really brought home to me what war is all about. It's about blood and flesh and families. And I wanted to go back to the Amaraya bomb shelter when I returned, and that's where I met Surah. And she was there filming a public service announcement. I went back during my first trip, and she was filming this public service announcement to commemorate the anniversary of this national tragedy. And she was so cute. I was without a translator, but we communicated anyway. And she took my hand and she showed me around, and we chit-chatted a little bit as best we could. And then we sort of optimistically exchanged addresses. I don't know why. There's not anything I could have done with her address. But when I went back to Iraq, I wanted to find her. Because in all the speaking that I did after I got home, she was the one who kept me going. And so when I got back to Iraq in June and July of 2003, I handed her address to my translator, and we go careening off into some neighborhood. And suddenly the car stops in front of some house, apartment building kind of thing. And he runs away, and I'm left standing on the sidewalk. And suddenly I start getting all these doubts. I mean, what would her parents think about an American showing up at her doorstep, right? Or was she even alive? Would she even remember me? I mean, we just had 15 minutes of sort of, pigeon conversation months before that. So as I'm standing there having all these doubts, all of a sudden I see this red streak come from the other side of me, and I turn around, and And it's Surah. She throws herself into my arms, and she gives me this kiss on the left cheek and kiss on the right cheek, and another one on the left, and she remembered me. She grabbed my hand and she took me upstairs, and I sat with her and her sisters and her father. They had just come back from the countryside where they had gone to stay with relatives during the first onslaught of the war. And they were, we're kind of chit-chatting back and forth through the translator. And at one point, I asked her family what they think was the cause of the war. And Surah, who had looked to her father for advice on every answer before she gave it, suddenly blurted out, oil. And it occurred to me that this little girl was 12 years old at the time. She was born the year of the first Gulf War. All she had ever known in her life was 2 wars and sanctions. And that's what her life has been like. I would love to find her again. I have no idea where she is now. In 2008, I had the opportunity to go to Damascus, Syria, and spend the summer there volunteering with Iraqi refugees. I'd mentioned that there were 26 million Iraqis at the time of the first bombing in March of 2003. Well, depending on the numbers you look at, anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million civilians have been killed as a result of this war. Another 5,000 US soldiers have been killed as a result of this war, about half of them under the age of 22, barely drinking age. Right? The other half are coming home with head injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumas that we haven't even begun to learn how to deal with yet in our healthcare system or in our society. But 4 million Iraqis are displaced. They're out of their homes. 2 million are internally displaced and 2 million have left the country. Just to give you an idea of those numbers, that would be like 4 times the size of Texas's population being displaced. Like 2 Texases living in the United States, homeless, trying to figure out where to go. And another 2 Texases coming to Mexico or going to Canada. And that's what's happened in the Middle East. 1.2 million Iraqis, so about a little more than half of the Iraqis who left Iraq have gone to Syria. So that was like, for them, that was like an infusion of Texas coming into their country at a time when they were experiencing 30% inflation, 25% unemployment. So Iraqi refugees in Syria are not allowed to work legally. When they do work illegally, they're not treated very well. They're certainly not paid very well. The kids are allowed to go to school, which was a huge thing that Syria did. It's a big gift that they've given to the refugees. But the schools are having a tough time with this very traumatized student population. So it's been extremely difficult for refugees. I have a friend that I met, Abdullah Al-Samareh, who I met on my first trip. He was a waiter in our little hotel that we were staying at the hostel. And I had stayed in touch with him by email during the war, and I've written about him. Some of you have read about him in El Ojo del Lago. He left in 2008 the States with his family after assisting U.S. soldiers. He got put on a list in Iraq. His house got stormed by Iraqi soldiers while his 2 young children were upstairs cowering. And he left with his family soon after that and left to Damascus. And he's been there since 2008, barely making it as a waiter. Everybody crammed into one unfurnished apartment because, you couldn't carry furniture with you. I just got word this week that he decided to go back to Iraq yesterday because he couldn't get work and he was tired of languishing. And that just scares me because it's not safe for him. But that's the situation of a lot of the languishing Iraqi refugees, and that's one of the legacies that the U.S.-led coalition has left in Iraq. I want to introduce you to Mustafa. When I took this picture, this was in the trip after the war had started. This is down in Basra. Mustafa is 9 days old in this photo. And he's dying of leukemia. And his doctor said, we cannot tell people their child will die. We just do our best. But what strikes me about this photo is his mom. Her name is Senna. Look at how she's pouring every ounce of everything she has into her dying son. And I was so impressed with her strength and with the strength and resilience of many of the women that I met in Iraq and the Iraqi refugees that I met in Damascus, that even though this information that I'm giving you today is really sobering, I know that, I just want to say that there's a lot of resilience and strength from the women who have been through these experiences that I think we can draw inspiration from. And I want to just, before we go into, I just want to close a little bit and then we can go into some questions and answers and conversation. I know this information is hard, so I don't want to leave you helpless the way I have felt so much during the time that I've been doing this work. I want to ask you today to join me in doing three things. Something personal, something political, and something spiritual. Now, on a personal level, there are probably a lot of reasons why the United States invaded Iraq, and we can debate that all we want, but let's face it, oil has a lot to do with the U.S. policies and the decisions that get made about the Middle East. So on a personal level, I'm trying to do everything I can to reduce my consumption, because I realize that every single thing I buy uses oil. Every single thing I recycle uses oil. Every single thing I throw away uses oil. So I look very carefully at the purchases I make and at the things that I decide to have in my life, because I want to start reducing those to reduce the amount of oil that I personally use. It matters to her. It really matters. On a political level, and I realize I'm talking to a group of people from a variety of different countries here, but let's face it, the U.S. led this coalition, so let's talk about U.S. politics for just a second. If 538 people had voted differently in Florida in the 2000 election, or had those votes been counted differently, we would not have had this war. This isn't a partisan thing, because the Democratic Congress went along with Republican President Bush in the invasion of Iraq. What I'm saying is that all of the numbers that I've given you today, the most important one is this. That war wouldn't have happened if 538 people had asked themselves, who's more likely to take us to war and who's more likely not to? And that discussion, that question has to happen at every level of politics. Because today's city council members are going to be tomorrow's members of parliament or members of Congress. And it's really critical that people who are serving at local and state levels think about the impact of their votes on how it's going to matter on issues around war and peace and our economy. So I know many of you here are expats. I want to just encourage you to get your absentee ballots and vote and ask these kinds of questions of your candidates and hold them accountable, even doing it from this far away. Because you folks know, more than most Americans do, what impact the U.S. foreign policies have in a foreign country. We're here. So every vote really does matter. It matters to her. On a spiritual level, and I'm still grappling with this myself, so don't hold me up to any example here, but I'm trying to live my life more the way I'd like to see my government live its life on the foreign stage. When I first started doing this talk, somebody sent me an email. It's a parable, a Native American parable about a Native American grandfather talking to his grandson and explaining that inside each of us we have two wolves that compete. One wolf represents greed and intolerance, and the other wolf represents peace and tolerance. And the grandson said, well, grandfather, if these two wolves are fighting in me, which one's going to win? And the grandfather said, whichever one you feed. So I ask you all today to just do what we can on a small microcosmic level to feed peace and to feed tolerance. That's the way we're really going to change the world. I want to thank you all for being here today and for allowing me to present this information to you. And I'm really interested in questions and answers now. Thank you. How do you do the Q&A? Do you have a microphone at this end?
We have microphones and we'll go around and to raise your hand, we'll give you a fine.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi, Gal.
A little loud. I know from being with you in one of the writing classes that you shared one of the incidences that the gun was pointed to your head in Iraq. Could you share that briefly? That danger and that you were exposed to?
Yeah, it wasn't pointed at my head, it was pointed at my chest. That oftentimes I'm asked about the scariest moment that I had in Iraq, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But one of the incidents that Gal's talking about is during the U.S. occupation, we had gone down, a few of us had gone down to Basra, which is in the southern part of Iraq, and gone to which is the port city there, just to see what kind of damage had been done and what was going on. And I'm not quite sure what happened after that. It might be that our driver took a wrong turn, or there were roadblocks everywhere and roads down. So it might be that our driver was legitimately looking for another avenue to get us back onto the main drag. But somehow we found ourselves kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And there was a roadblock ahead, and I leaned forward. We were in a van, and I leaned forward with my camera, a flash camera, right? I was using film, and leaned forward and took a photo, as did one of the other delegates who was with us, an 80-plus-year-old Japanese woman, also leaned forward to take a picture. Suddenly, we were stopped by U.S. soldiers. The van was surrounded. We were told to get out. I was always the first to get out to talk to the soldiers, like the canary in the coal mine, right? Like the young white girl, right? Let's stick her out there. And so I jumped out. Hi, guys. Where are you from? I'm from America. Where are you from? And this Sergeant Stewart, he said, America, ma'am. I said, hey, yeah. Where? He said, that's none of your concern, ma'am. I said, gun, pointed right at me. His rifle pointing right at me. And everybody else in the van came out. And now, from their perspective, I can understand this. From their perspective, they saw a van coming at them with our Iraqi driver and our Iraqi translator sitting in front, the two Iraqis sitting in front, and then flashes from inside the van. So I can understand why they were scared. You can imagine how scared we were as well. And they wanted to get our film. I had left my camera in the car, and Yasuko, the Japanese woman I was with, said that she had taken 2 photos to cover me, and they wanted her film. And it wasn't enough that she just opened up the back of the camera and exposed the film, which would have ruined any of the pictures. They wanted the film out. Well, if you remember those old cameras with a film, they're like super glued in there until they're ready to come out. And so she's trembling. She's really, we're nervous, we're scared. She's trembling, it's hot, we've got guns pointed at us. And this Sergeant Stewart is not relenting at all. And the situation is just getting worse and worse and worse and worse, until finally one of the soldiers came up and helped Yasuko with her camera and got the film out. And then we went on our way. But it occurred to me that, not that I would think that any American soldiers would hurt me. In fact, it was just the opposite. I felt that there would be some level of protection if I needed it. But still, I was out in the middle of nowhere, and anything could have happened. And that was when I realized just how truly vulnerable, we were in some of the circumstances. But it's as scary as that was, the scariest moment I had was sneaking into the Baghdad Sheraton, into a meeting that was being held by Bechtel. Do y'all know who Bechtel is? Right? They were one of the corporations, U.S.-based corporations that won these no-bid contracts to rebuild Iraq, like Halliburton, these different companies. So I heard that this was a public meeting. So I go traipsing up to room 202, the Baghdad Sheraton, and I walk right in and I sit down, and I'm watching these Iraqis come in with their 10-page application filled out in English to interview for a job to get a contract to rebuild Iraq's airport that had been bombed. So Randy Jackson from Dallas, Texas, who was Bechtel's representative, was there to interview people. And he would ask questions like, how old is your equipment? How many employees do you have? Do you have insurance? Well, the insurance was a stopper, of course, because this was right after the war had happened, and Iraqis were not used to having to pay for insurance up front. In fact, they weren't used to paying for materials up front. So one man looked at Randy Jackson and said, insurance? The government was our insurance. What am I supposed to do? And Randy Jackson said, don't worry, there'll be American companies like Ajijic coming in to sell you insurance. So that that moment, I realized that in order for an Iraqi to get a job, they have to go to an American company to buy insurance in order to go to an American company to get a job to rebuild the airport that the Americans bombed. That was when I realized that it was maybe a little more than oil. That was the interest that was going on over there. Other questions?
Okay, Kelly, thank you so much for your talk. I read that you spoke to a group of women members of Congress, and I'm assuming that you told them about the effects of the use of the depleted uranium weapons. What was the reaction?
The reaction was horror, and I don't think members of Congress are aware of that kind of level of minutia that goes on in warfare. Yeah, it's a very remote kind of situation that happens with the votes and what's happening really on the ground over here. I was terribly excited about I was part of a panel actually, and Eleanor Schmiel was part of the panel from NOW, National Organization for Women, which is one of my heroines. And it was a talk that was taped for Lifetime and shown on Lifetime. So I was really thrilled to have the opportunity to take this message out to such a wide audience. But the real thrill for me during that trip to Washington was that I had a chance to meet with my congressman's chief of staff. My congressman, I'm from Santa Monica, California. My congressman is Henry Waxman, who is a Democrat, at the time was in the minority, and the head of the committee that looks at oversight on military budgets and all kinds of government waste. And Congressman Waxman and his chief of staff had both been to Iraq after the war started, and they were, very excited, very intrigued with what I brought back. And I told them that Bechtel story, because I had written that up and it had been published in my local newspaper, the Santa Monica Daily Press. Y'all read that, right? Great paper, great paper. Great columnists. You want to read that right after you read Aloha Galaga. So I gave them the article that I'd written, and I had tried to get that article published in the LA Times. I had tried to get some attention around this issue on how the bar was being set too high for Iraqis to be able to rebuild their own country. And Henry Waxman, Congressman Waxman, ended up writing a letter both to the White House and to Bechtel asking about this. And nothing happened. He got no response. But he did get this in the LA Times. And one morning, I opened up the LA Times, and I'm reading this article about how U.S. companies are setting the bar too high for Iraqis to rebuild their own country. I'm like, oh my gosh! I'm just a girl from Santa Monica who got on a plane and walked into a hotel room. I mean, I'm astounded that we have that kind of power as individuals to be able to bring these stories back, wherever the stories come from. So it was a very personally powerful, empowering trip for me to go to Washington and to address this congresswoman and to have a chance to address my own congressman and do that. So thank you for asking about it. Margaret, go ahead. Please.
No.
Okay, we'll go here, here, and then back here.
Do you have any plans to go to Libya?
I would love to go to Libya and Tunisia and Egypt right now. I would give anything to be in the Middle East with a purpose and funding. And funding. That's not I just don't have the opportunity right now, and I really want to focus on getting my book done with this message. But please sign up, though, to be on my email list, and you'll hear about other trips that I take, because I do want to try to schedule another trip to the Middle East, probably in the winter. Is the email list going around, by the way? Has everybody had a chance to look at it? No? Okay, we'll bring it back up here. Thank you.
Hi. Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much. My name is Martha Ketchum. I am visiting Ajijic. My friend Karuna, she lives here, and I'm very happy to be here. And I thank you all because, as I heard you speak, I think if more American communities would live in other parts of the world, this wouldn't happen. So thank you for taking care of Ajijic as much as you do. And I have to tell you that I didn't know that I was going to hear your conference this morning at all, because my late husband was the Mexican ambassador to the UN at the time of the Iraq War. And he was fired because he organized the Security Council not to vote for the Iraq invasion. Thank you so much for all your work.
Is there another question
Oh, I just got chills.
or comment?
That's amazing. Thank you.
Margaret, right there.
Thank you, Kelly. We have an Air Force Academy. We have an ambulance. We have West Point. Don't you really and truly think we could have a peace academy? It's really something, I think, that could be worked on a little bit easier than people think. I don't know how those other academies got going, but all of those academies promote, and are involved with war. And you had that one powerful statement about when the woman said, all we want is peace. So I see you as a leader, a beautiful leader. So I give you a challenge. Be the founder of our peace.
You know, you're absolutely right. And Representative Dennis Kucinich, who's from Ohio, has been working on trying to get a bill passed in the U.S. Congress to create a peace academy. You'd think it wouldn't be that tough, right? Yeah.
Well, my name is Carlos Tamay. I come from Guatemala, another country that was invaded by the United States in 1954. So I thank you for your messages of peace and of what is the result of an unfair invasion to a country. Because we also suffered after that for 36 years of internal armed conflict. So I understand what you were talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Martha. I want to follow up on something that Martha said just very briefly. I think it really is important when we have opportunities to visit other countries firsthand and see what these experiences are. I was inspired, I think, kind of in the background to go to Iraq because there are so many people in Los Angeles who've gone down to Guatemala and come back and given testimony, eyewitness testimony about their experiences there. So I put a couple of resources up here on this board. One of them is MiddleEastFellowship.org. I'm not affiliated with any of these groups. This is MiddleEastFellowship.org. They do a 1-month program in Syria every summer that is extremely affordable. It's under $2,000 and it covers everything except your airfare and meals and visa. But you get Arabic lessons, you get a dormitory stay, and most importantly, an opportunity to work with Iraqi refugees. So it's MiddleEastFellowship.org. This was the trip that I was on in Syria, so I'd be happy to answer any questions about it. Another good organization is IraqiStudentProject.org. 2 Americans living in Damascus started an organization to bring Iraqi college students to the United States under full scholarship. And they have 14 universities in the U.S. that are providing full scholarships for an Iraqi refugee. Now, these are refugees that have, fabulous grades. They've been able to pass their English exams very well. And the kids get scholarships. It's basically funded by people like you and me through, $20, $50, $100 donations or whatever. So again, I'm not affiliated with this organization, but I wanted to let you know that this resource is available. I blog at peacepathfoundation.org, and you'll find my email address there as well. So, thank you.
I'm just wondering, I grew up doing work and after World War II. Do people ever learn? Do they always have to bomb people who cannot look after themselves or fight back? I don't understand. The American mostly, that they can, after all these years, bomb civilians.
I wish I had an answer for that.
Read.
Natural
Read.
resources.
Read.
It's amazing to me how I remember both of the Iraqi wars very well, and TV minute-to-minute coverage, and it's amazing to me how the news media and the television media, we always have on the white hat. We are always helping. We never bomb hospitals or schools or homes or anything like that. And the American people believe it, and they don't know what's going on. I remember everybody cheering when they pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein. But we thought that the Iraqi people were suffering terribly, and we were going to help them, you know? Same thing's going on in Libya and all those other countries.
And then we learned
It's
that,
enough to make you sick.
and then we learned that that pulling down of the statue in Theodore Square was staged for the media.
I'm not surprised one bit.
Yeah. When I was doing this talk, I used to address fifth graders a lot, because in the United States, part of the fifth grade curriculum is to learn about 5 clues of Islam and that part of the world. And so some progressive teachers would have me in to address their kids. And one of the things that I would always start off with is sort of answering the question about why I went to Iraq a little differently. And I explained to the kids that I, for my profession, have been a professional public relations consultant. So my job was to set the stage for what you saw on TV or what you read in the newspaper. And one of the most important tools I would use when I do that, when I pull this out of my blue bag, the kids would always laugh, is an empty toilet paper roll. And the reason for that is that this is the way a TV camera sees the world. Right? So when I set up a room, I'm looking around to see what's going to be in this circle. When I went to Iraq, I went for 2 reasons. I wanted to know why they were showing me this and what I wasn't seeing out here. It doesn't mean this is wrong. It just means it's incomplete. And frankly, what I've given you today is this over here, right? I mean, it's another slice of it, just another slice. And I think it's important that, you know, I appreciate that you're all here to learn more and to have an opportunity to, you know, engage in this kind of a conversation, because that shows that, you know, we've got some engaging minds here, and that's the only way I think that we are going to avoid future wars, is to have people really raise their level of understanding about what's going on, and to try to change the way the U.S. faces its economy. But thank you for your question about the media.
Got time for maybe one more question?
First of all, I want to congratulate you on what you're doing. I think it's incredibly important. And I'm going to ask a question that nobody's asked yet. And I want to make it clear that in Chattanooga, I and other religious leaders demonstrated against the war. My first point that I do want to make is nobody's answered your original question. I didn't understand the reason for the joke, especially how it was connected to your wonderful talk. But I want to ask you, you're writing a wonderful book on peace and what you see. When you write a book on peace, do you feel that do you believe that there are any conditions for the efficacy of war? That is to say, is your book basically a book on, are you a pacifist and you're therefore saying war under all circumstances is irresponsible, wrong, etc., or do you deal with that incredibly complex issue?
I don't. And it's a very important, it's the important question, isn't it? And I'm still wrestling with that myself. So it would be really easy for me to say, based on what I've seen, it would be very easy for me to say that the United States should never initiate a war, that there's really no justification. I can't come up with a justification for us initiating a war. I also think that there are situations that it's tough. I mean, I'm glad we got involved in World War II to stop the Nazis, you know? So I'm very torn on that. Personally, I'm very torn on that, and I haven't really come to any kind of reconciliation in it, and I don't deal with that in the book. In the book, I deal more with human condition and the specific experiences that I saw.
Thanks for your honesty.
Thank you for your work.
That concludes our questions. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Kelly.
When are you going back? Oh, about
Stay here, stay here.
I'm going back to the States or going back to the Middle East?
To the Middle East.
I would love to go back, but I don't want to go back to Iraq unless I really have a purpose to go, because an American over there put so many Iraqis in danger. Drivers, translators, and I just don't want to do that to somebody's family.
Thanks for
Thank you.
a wonderful, stimulating talk.
Thank you all.
Our speaker next week, gentleman who asked the last question, Bill Posner. Doing Time in Mississippi, a Freedom Riders adventure. I'm sure with some songs too. Don't miss it. That concludes our session today. Please pick up coffee cups and stack the chairs by color and style. Thank you all for coming.